perhaps each of you could address what influenced your interest in ethics and mapping, and your focus on maybe on inclusion. If you want to each take about a minute to tell us a little bit about your own journey, that would be great. And Christine, we could start with you.
Strangely enough, my interest was sparked while I was working in Africa. There I learned that local communities have a great deal to say if we listen. So the ability to listen to what the locals said was what started me off on my journey towards a different kind of map and a different kind of mapping.
Oh, thank you.
Development from within, development from below. Power to the people, not to the outside cartographers.
Well, thanks. And Christine, I'm sure that some of the probably a lifelong interest, but I just wondered if there was any particular, time or event that really sparked your interest in ethics and mapping.
Okay, good. Mic's on. No particular event, but rather in belonging to a community that has pretty much not ever been included in a map. Right now, in the community that I'm from, and really in the district where I went to school, we have at least a 25% Indigenous population, but we don't appear on maps because we're not an on-reserve population. And so really, any of my interest in this inclusive cartography really stems from, I don't know, it's not the desire, but really the need to make sure that future generations and really those next ones coming up, that they know who they are, they know their culture, but also that they're welcome in these spaces. Starting with my great-grandmother to my grandfather and then to my father and then to me, we were taught to not necessarily be proud of who we are as Algonquin people. And so really trying to make sure that those next generations can celebrate who they are and really know who they are from their very first breath that they take when they're earthside here with us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Reginald?
Y'all hear me? Yeah, I don't know that there was a particular event, but I started as a land surveyor and I didn't feel welcome in that community, or didn't feel included, I should say. And when I moved more towards just mapping and getting into GIS, moved into geography space, then I felt like I can do a lot more with the technology and the opportunities to connect with people. And so that was probably really the beginning of that.
Great. And Vanessa?
Yeah, so for me, it also, I guess, is lifelong. I have like a really multi-tiered answer. Both my parents are from other countries and they both grew up during and post-dictatorship. So I just grew up learning a lot about inclusivity and how that really matters and the real harm of not including people can be. My dad's from Germany, my mom's from Chile. They both quite literally saw people die. And I also, I didn't initially intend to get into cartography. So when I started in the field, I felt so much imposter syndrome and lost quite a bit. And then there was a bunch of ageism things and sexism things. And I also ended up being at 2 toxic jobs. And while a lot of my industry stuff for my thesis was on like aesthetics and mapping and really pushing a lot of that, I would say in the past decade, I have become known for talking about inclusivity just because of my very real, as like a trauma response, I would just kind of talk about stuff because I knew from silent conversations, not very visible to everyone else, that a lot of people weren't experiencing a lot of the painful things that I was experiencing. So that's, I guess, why I started being really loud about it, because the more you talk about it and are open about it, then the more people will realize they're not alone. And then hopefully the more people will realize that it needs to be discussed and that things need to change.
Wow, so it seems like all of you observed or experienced the opposite of inclusivity, and that really is a a motivational force. I think we have about 15 minutes, so maybe Dr. Taylor, I'll just ask you first. I noticed that your work includes reclamation and preservation of the indigenous languages and place names. And then also other panelists might want to comment as well. Also the importance of community-based decisions in the development of the Indigenous Digital Atlas mapping research that you did. I also know there's some initiatives at national mapping organization levels to maybe start to honor Indigenous place names and in a national, regional, and local data sets. And you have experience with this. Would you described a bottom-up approach, but do you have advice for the at least the initiatives of top-down and how they might do that better?
Yeah, I think some of this I covered in my presentation.
Mm-hmm.
First thing is listen to what people have to say. Respond to their needs first and your needs second. This means a change in power from a national mapping organization controlling all mapping to a new relationship with Indigenous communities where the Indigenous community needs come first, not last.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great advice. Thank you. Christine, you've created and led both businesses and nonprofit organizations that celebrate Indigenous ancestral knowledge and culture-based practices. Do you see differences in the approaches? Are they both effective in increasing awareness about knowledge systems and thinking about those who are outside of the Indigenous peoples and the importance of inclusion, or maybe they both are effective in different ways?
I think they're both effective in different ways. Certainly with a nonprofit that has a global reach, there's a much larger audience per se, but in my own businesses that I'm now working for kind of more full-time and taking that leap, I'm able to work, I don't know, I'm able to kind of pick and choose those places where I feel the most safe and also can have the most impact. And in a lot of my own work right now, I end up working a lot with youth, as well as really starting to push boundaries. But I will say, you know, in my work with Native land, it's almost like more welcome in a space. Whereas when I'm on my own and under the banner of Wasaya Consulting, quite often I have a lot of difficulty really pushing through. There's a lot of pushback and a lot of questioning and a lot of marginalization of knowledge and like a lot of just, you know, there's almost, I know Vanessa's mentioned this as well too, but you know, it's an interesting role to be in as an individual, as an Indigenous woman, making people feel uncomfortable. But there's a really beautiful moment when people become comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's when you expand your knowledge. So really back to that, you know, both of those realms with a nonprofit and also private businesses, though they're different, they still have that same approach. But on an individual level, there's a heck of a lot more emotional labor that goes on this consulting side of things.
Okay, so it takes bravery, I think, to do this and to also participate in it. So that's awesome. I don't know, Vanessa or any other panel members wanted to add to that?
We could probably talk all day about this.
Okay. Maybe save it for break for your lunch. Okay. Dr. Archer, I was relating to what you had talked about at TSU, because I'm the director of a center for Geospatial Research, where we really try to get students involved in our research. And I wondered if you had a similar experience that, or maybe a question would be, do your students come from these different domains first? They're interested in the research of hazards or public health or vulnerability or environmental justice, and then want to learn the geospatial skills? Or are they focused more on the technologies themselves, and then kind of the applications come after that?
So my students, the undergraduate students, they don't know what they want a lot of times. They don't, some of them, well, most are not necessarily interested in the technology. They're interested in the products. They're interested in the maps and using the maps and developing a map to help with whatever issue that they're trying to resolve or trying to investigate. And a lot of, there's only a few of us on my campus who do GIS mapping. And so we get called on quite a bit. And we're generalists a lot of times, where we can approach many different types of projects because as we know, everything that happens somewhere and at some time. So we can use maps to help to describe those issues. What I find with the students a lot of times is they may have a passion that, this is what I want to do when I'm done with school. I want to have this type of job and I want to be in this industry and make this type of money. But then when it comes to, well, let's talk about a final project and let's come up with some ideas. And those ideas usually have nothing to do with their passions. And they usually go back to the communities they come from, or their high school or their elementary school, and issues at home and those types of things. And so my approach is to get to know those students in that sense and figure out, okay, how can we approach these issues with the science and what you've been learning in the classroom, and how do we merge those, and how do we find the intersection so that you can both approach this and be passionate about it using the tools that we have available to us. And so I try to teach them how to use the technology, but at the same time, how to basically involve their whole self in their projects, and so that their outputs are very meaningful to them. And it's not just, here's a clean data set, take a look at it, produce something, and it's meaningless. So I think that's really helpful for the students, and that's when they seem to get that light bulb, like, aha, oh, this is something that I can apply, or I can use, or I can help further develop. Why doesn't the technology do this? Great question. Let's make it do that. And let's figure out how to make it do that. And so the approach is usually, it's kind of that bottom-up approach, more like, what are you really interested in, and how can we apply these tools, technology, and knowledge, the content and skills to help you to bring that into this industry.
And I also know as a teacher that moment when you see the spark, that's all the reward we need. That's a wonderful moment. Vanessa, I loved you said that you work in a variety of settings doing mappy things, but you've worked in federal government, nonprofits, tech industry, higher education, and that you keep this positive belief that everyone can become a better analyst, designer, and storyteller. That really resonated with me, because effective communication and public outreach are so important in what we do. And I think we don't learn how to do that. We don't feel comfortable doing that. So what do you think is the best way to add spatial to our stories and to get more comfortable in increasing awareness about these issues and reaching a more inclusive audience?
Yeah, first I want to say this felt like such a hard question to answer in a short period of time, because like with so much variety of experience and very different ways of making maps and the audience changing, I think I kind of have a multi-tiered response here, both from an internal perspective of those who are making maps and then those who are receiving the maps and being mapped about. And basically, I think it's really important to keep communication better than it may be across teams internally. As you said, sometimes people can be really isolated. Cartographers often can be isolated from the data teams and who's creating data, which sounds a little wild, but that has happened to me a few times. And it's really important to remember that everyone who is touching the data needs to really be involved in all the conversations, because when you're creating a map and designing the map, you do need to, in order to make it the best map, understand how the data was collected, how was it analyzed, how was it produced. And of course, I'm sure many in the room may have access to the full pipeline, but it does happen in across industries where people actually like receive the data way later. And of course, if you're researching data and finding it on your own, like when I was in humanitarian aid, it's even harder for like direct disaster responses, because the data may barely exist and you have to scrounge and try to find new context. And that's another way communication really matters. And in terms of external communication, I think we're always taught to think about the audience. But we don't necessarily learn exactly how to do that, I think. And there's some ways where you really are told to center yourself in the audience, and you may ask your client what they really need, but we're so often responding to map requests from people who don't necessarily understand spatial. So we have to make sure we're also educating people, perhaps more than we expect, for what maps really mean, and also giving advice on what else it could be besides what they're just asking. And I think another aspect that was touched on earlier today is that our industry is constantly evolving, technologically speaking. We're constantly using new softwares, or softwares change, like ArcMap to ArcPro, for example. I mean, even like within our own industry, we make jokes about how ArcPro is hard to use when you've never used it. I don't know if anyone's seen any of the memes and stuff, but I always laugh because it's true. But on the user side, that makes it more complicated, because then you really have to be thinking about like, what am I going to give them that if they need to use it, will they be able to use it? And will it change in the future? And the other parts of it too is just with so many different technologies, you maybe want to see who the actual end user is going to, how they're going to interact with it. So like for the mapping applications that were mentioned before, I do think our industry does need to do more user research, because usually when you're listening to a company saying, we really need to make this because we see this gap, it is true, but you do need to talk to the people who are actually going to use it, which I think both of you talked about a lot. And that is user research, and that is technically a field in its own right. But I think we can pull more of that into cartography at large. And finally, I do think, relating to everything else, tool agnostic tends to help. Of course, many people are heavily reliant on very particular softwares, and no one needs to learn everything, but it's helpful to have access to knowledge that you do not have, whether that's a colleague that's an expert in something that you don't know, or just having, you know, a broader network of people that you can reach out to and ask questions. That can be attending conferences like these, or joining online virtual things. Like I know on Twitter, I check GIS chat sometimes to ask questions, and there's a myriad of other ways, but we can't possibly know everything, but we do need to be doing due diligence and asking others about stuff. Oh, and one other thing, sorry, again, I said I could talk about this endlessly. Some things that cartography can still improve on in terms of reaching a more diverse group of people. Accessibility in cartography still has a lot of growing to do for blind and vision impaired folks. And that's not talked about enough, I think. And I think technology, with it constantly shifting, is often lagging behind. And I think that that's something that would be great to see growth in the near future. And that's it, I think.
Oh, thanks. I guess that was a dense question, but you really hit all the points. Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left. I don't know if any of you want to comment on any of these, or we could take a question from the audience.
Yes, I would like to.
Yeah, someone did one.
Points for me. The visual is necessary, but not sufficient. We have to look at new forms of maps and mapping, particularly in the social media environment. We need new ways to allow people to tell their stories, which are based on location and visualization, but added to that, sound and other ways of expressing ourselves and telling good stories. And there are new forms of mapping out there. Our cyber cartographic atlases, the photo atlases that are emerging. We have to look at new ways of expressing ourselves and telling stories, and not be bound by the space in which those stories are to be told. Storytelling is critical, and we have to find ways of telling stories in ways that people understand, using as many senses as possible.
Yes, that's very, very true. It's making me think about, we've been using some augmented reality headsets and virtual reality, you know, and
Or the above.
yes, yes. But you know, the human factor part of that is I love trying them out, but usually I get nauseous. It's the headset on my head, or it's the motion or something. So you know, that really is going back to the user's experience and being you know, conscious of that. One of my colleagues is working with a psychologist to really see how people react to or adapt to, you know, that kind of augmented reality experience. So yeah, that's really, really great advice. Thank you.
Dr. Archer wanted to also say something. I just want to flag that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention, since Vanessa mentioned the spatial thinking, and you asked about my students. My students come from, I'm in the College of Agriculture, Department of Ag and Environmental Sciences. I have students that do all kinds of things, and I have students from urban policy and all the different departments on campus. But one of the things that a lot of people, even the administration and just people in general that don't know, what we do necessarily, think that this is just a tool. The mapping is just a tool. And I think knowing how is one thing, but knowing why is really important. I mentioned that in my talk. And so I try to get students to understand or think more about the spatial thinking and spatial literacy and the why of where, as you know, we talk about in our fields. And that seems to help a lot in terms of, this is why I want to use this. And I asked all my students in their senior projects class, stuff like that, the easiest way to get bonus points is to add a map. To anything you do, if you have maps, and their question is why, and I'll say, I'll show you. As soon as you provide a map of, where something's happening or why you're interested in this, then we can start to talk about the why. And I think it's really important to address that from that standpoint versus just, here's a tool that you can use to make a map. But there's more to be told when we start thinking about the whys.
Oh, it's really important, and it elevates the importance of it for the students, but also for us. Sometimes I feel a little bit like people say, well, you're just using these tools, and there's so much more to it. And I guess just Christine, did you have any final thoughts or anything you wanted to mention?
I'm good, but thank you.
Okay. Well, I know it's